Welcome back to the second half of Talking Europe. Calling EU institutions into question, our next guest wants more transparency when it comes to the EU-US trade negotiations. She's also called into question the amount of say lobbyists may be having when it comes to making EU laws, and challenged the European Central Bank. With us we have EU Ombudsman, Ms. Emily O'Reilly. Ms. O'Reilly, welcome to the show and thanks for your time.
Thank you.
Now, you are the woman any EU citizen can go to if they have complaints about how EU institutions are working or rather not working, whether it's about fundamental rights, the legality of things, or just simply the administration being too slow, too cumbersome. Are you inundated with complaints?
We do get a lot. We get thousands of complaints every year from European citizens, because a lot of them, because they all have ombudsman or ombudsman type institutions in their own member state. They're familiar with the institution. But an awful lot of the complaints that we get go straight back to the member state ombudsman because they are against their own national administration. I am the ombudsman for the European institutions, for the Commission, for the Council, for the non-political part of the Parliament, and for all of the EU agencies. So anybody who has a problem, who feels they haven't been treated fairly, if they have had contact with the Commission, with any of the agencies, they can come to me and I'll try and solve their problem for them.
Okay, fascinating, and we'll get into a few examples maybe in just a few minutes, but there's one thing when we talk about transparency and all of this that's really we can't avoid in recent days and weeks. It's this Panama Papers. That was more about, though, transparency among individuals rather than institutions. Just on a personal level, how transparent do you think politicians need to be individually, or is that really their private lives?
Well, I think it's gone beyond just a matter of ethics. I think, and I often say this, that we're in a whole new era now. We're in an era of social media, internet, hacking, all of that. There's a huge expectation, particularly among the young generation who have the world at their hands if they have a smartphone, that everything is going to be out there. And there's a much higher expectation of openness and transparency than there would have been in an older generation. Also, stuff is going to get out. The Panama Papers, we had the Snowden Papers, WikiLeaks, all of that. And I think even if they don't feel that it's what they particularly want to do, I think the way the world is now is that there is a demand for people to do it. And therefore, I think politicians, administrations are going to be forced to be more open, whether they like it or not. So for them, it's a good idea to get in first, to be proactive about what they're putting out there and not allowed to be, to be leaked out.
Indeed, we've already seen a reaction from the European Commission in response to this Panama Papers. They say they're going to be putting more elements and rules in place to try and avoid this tax avoidance and even evasion. Shirley Sitbon tells us more about the latest plans.
The EU wants to show it's opposed to tax avoidance and is doing everything to fight it. It came up with this video to explain how scheming to pay less taxes costs society and how the EU Commission is planning to tackle the problem. The project isn't new. EU regulators and MPs have been working on it since the previous tax avoidance scandal, LuxLeaks, in 2014. The Panama Papers controversy, involving several leaders like David Cameron, has pushed governments to show they're acting quickly. The idea is to harmonise policies across the EU and create a common blacklist of tax havens within 6 months. Right now, Panama is classified as one by less than half of EU states. The Commission wants to also force multinational companies to pay their share of taxes, release their profits or turnover, and the taxes they pay in each EU state.
Well, we heard there earlier in the week, in recent days, the EU Financial Services Commissioner Jonathan Hill saying that really in response to this Panama Papers scandal, they will now be asking large multinationals that operate in Europe, that make profits in Europe, but who declare taxes elsewhere, like, for example, in Panama, that they would now have to make this known. Do you think this is part of the solution, and do you think multinationals are going to be transparent?
Depends on the multinational, I suppose. I mean, we were all still coming to terms with the revelations of the Panama Papers, and every country is going to have a different political response, and the EU, as you just said, is going to have a different political response. In my experience, whenever a scandal like this, a crisis arises, we have lots of political solutions, lots of people suggesting they're going to do this, that and the other. But in the long term, the question is how much will change. But I think this increases the pressure, certainly on the EU, on multinationals, on member state governments as well, many of whom particularly in Europe, are struggling with an electorate that has lost an awful lot of trust in the institutions, the political institutions, the administrative institutions and so on. And I think in order to restore trust, I think the politicians in every country and in the EU are going to have to listen to the people's response to this and respond accordingly.
And I think one of the things perhaps EU citizens lost trust with in the EU is with our dealings with the refugee crisis. You know, a lot of people are questioning our fundamental rights. Are we not pushing that aside, notably with this EU-Turkey deal?
Absolutely, where my role is not in the political decisions that are made to attempt to sort this out. And I think we're looking at multiple crises. You know, Brexit impacts on the migration crisis impacts on Brexit, which impacts on the economic crisis and the political crisis in different member states. My main work in this area has been in relation to Frontex, which is the border agency, which at the moment is charged with really, in a sense, implementing part of that EU deal with Turkey, and that they're the people who are actually charged with bringing people back from Greece and bringing them into Turkey and so on. So I've done a lot of work in relation to how Frontex lives up to its obligations under the Charter of Fundamental Rights and under the treaty and under its own statute in relation to that. But I mean, such is the volume of people and such is the sense of panic around this particular area that it can be difficult to control.
Now, there was a big dossier on the table, and we know that US President Barack Obama is in Germany. It'll no doubt be part of the discussions on the 24th of April. There, it's the Transatlantic Trade and Partnership Agreement, TTIP as we're starting to call it. Back in 2014, you already called for more transparency in this field. It seemed like a lot of the working documents were really being hidden over on the US side of things. We now have reading rooms. MEPs, members of the European Parliament, are allowed in to see the text, but only under very strict conditions with a paper and pen and only for a certain length of time. And is this enough? Do you think there's still secret dealings in this?
Well, some people don't think so, and politicians in the member states, I think they can now access certain documents as well in the circumstances that you have described. When I came into office in 2013, I detected there was an awful lot of concern around the transparency of the TTIP negotiations. This was coming from NGOs, but also from business, but also, interestingly, from parliamentarians themselves who wanted to know what was going to be done. But I think the Juncker Commission has committed itself to greater transparency, and certainly the the Trade Commissioner, Malmström, she has done a lot of work to try and make this process a lot more transparent, because people are demanding it. We no longer live in a society where trade deals can be done as they were in the past, behind closed doors, in secret, and then they're given to the people, perhaps for ratification or perhaps not. So when I began my investigation into this and coincided with other people equally putting pressure on the Commission. So in fairness to the Commission, they have done a lot of work in relation to making this more transparent. There is a different sensibility, shall we say, on the US side in relation to making certain things a secret. But the point I've made, I mean, I'm neutral in relation to TTIP, though those are political decisions, obviously, but I say there is a business case for it to be made more transparent, because if it's not made more transparent, then people won't trust that there's nothing to be concerned about.
It does seem, Ms. O'Reilly, that's a big part of it. It seems a very different culture on secrecy in the EU compared to the US. I mean, but one thinks often the compromise we find is the lowest common denominator. So could the US revoke these things?
I don't know, but I mean, I think in fairness to the EU and to Commissioner Malmström, I mean, she has been very open about this. I mean, and I think she has struggled to some extent, certainly in relation to transparency with the US, to convince them that the world is not going to, you know, collapse if they allow people to see certain papers and certain records and certain documents. Some people have said that, okay, we've opened up the reading rooms, we're putting all this stuff online, but only 50 people, only 5 people have looked at it. And my reply to that is, well, okay, because most citizens aren't that immediately interested, because it's very abstract and can be very complex. But as long as there are people who do understand it and who can see it and who can mediate it then to their communities, then that is what is important, and it'll make it much easier for people to get it across the line at the end if that's what people wish.
Because that's actually the next question. We're allowed in, well, certain people are allowed in to read it, but they're not really allowed to say what they've read, are they? I mean, there seems to be very tight control.
That has always been a bit of a puzzle to me, because I speak to lots of MEPs and they say, well, we go into the reading room and, you know, I think now they're allowed a piece of paper and a pencil and they can take notes. But when I ask them, well, what exactly can you do with this information? It's not as clear. I suppose in fairness, it is to inform them, and I suppose if they are talking to their constituents, they can perhaps be in a position to reassure them about certain things that they may have concerns about. So, I mean, it is a positive. It's better than not being allowed in.
Absolutely. Now, we did hear from one Irish MEP at one point, Nessa Childers, questioning the amount of access lobbyists had in these EU-US trade negotiations, notably the tobacco industry, and it seemed like the Commission may have censored some of the documents around that.
Well, if you're talking about a particular case that I was involved in, this was a case that came to me that when there was a big tobacco directive that was agreed and passed by Parliament just a few years ago, and it was a huge thing because it basically controls how the tobacco industry and therefore the public health outcomes of the tobacco industry are regulated within Europe. And a complaint came to us that certain meetings that had been held with the Commission and with the tobacco industry had not been put out there. They weren't transparent. Now, I don't want to make things too complicated, but basically the EU is party to a UN, a World Health Organization agreement, which tries to limit the amount of interaction there is between governments and the tobacco industry, because essentially it's been given sort of pariah status, if you like. It's a very special zone that the tobacco industry is in, because an estimated 700,000 people in Europe every year die through tobacco-related illnesses. So when we looked at the files, one of the powers that I have is I can see anything, even files that are secret or confidential. There weren't secret meetings in the sense that had you put in a transparency request, you would have been told by them about them. But the thing is, you had to go to the trouble of doing that. And my view was that under this convention, this tobacco convention that the EU is a party to, should be proactive. In other words, it should immediately say, put online, we're going to meet with so-and-so from Philip Morris or so-and-so from whatever tobacco company it is. They didn't do that. So my recommendation was that the Commission has to be proactive and put all of those meetings online. Now, to date, the Commission has refused my recommendation. I'm very surprised, I'm very astonished really, because given the very good track record they've had to date in relation to transparency. But very shortly I'm going to have a seminar at which the Health Commissioner is going to take part, and I think he is very supportive of what I am trying to do. So I'm hoping I will get this recommendation across the line, because I think it's very important. It's very important for European citizens.
Yeah, to put pressure another way, but I believe Philip Morris gives something like €1 billion to the EU in terms of a budget every year, and people call into question then what kind of access it gives them in a myriad of organisations, and they even have contact with Olaf, that anti-fraud agency in the EU.
Yes, well, I think that what you're talking about relates to a deal that was done with the EU and the Philip Morris other tobacco companies in relation to drug smuggling and so on.
Which is up for renewal, I believe,
in July. It's up for renewal. There's a lot of controversy in that. The decision has been pushed out a bit, but we'll see what's happened. But I think what that points to is that there's a greater consciousness, not just within the media and trade and industry, but among people, the ordinary citizen, if there's such a thing, in general, about the power of the tobacco lobby. And I think increasingly the tobacco lobby is finding it more difficult to have influence, but it is still very influential. And of course, to use an expression I'm not sure whether you're too familiar with, a lot of member states have skin in the game, because a lot of their countries, support tobacco industries. A lot of their constituents are employed within the tobacco industry, and we have to be understanding of that as well. But I think public health has to be paramount.
And I guess that's another issue you've brought up to the table recently. I know you've called on the Commission to publish not just when they're meeting with lobbyists, but the minutes of many of their meetings, notably concerning these expert groups. There's over 800 of them. They're involved when the EU Commission is putting laws together, and there are valid questions over who exactly these experts are.
Exactly. I mean, a lot of people think that the European bureaucracy in the shape of the Commission is absolutely huge. It's actually not. It's 30,000 people, but 30,000 people can't do by themselves everything that the EU needs to do, because in a sense the EU has become a global regulator, because the regulations that it makes for pharmaceuticals, for chemicals, for technology and so on, they have implications for the rest of the world as well. So they get people in to advise them, and they form expert groups, which are what they say, experts in the areas in which the EU wants to make legislation. They advise them. So I did an investigation into this, and I made certain recommendations in relation to making sure that people are aware of how this advice is being given, who's giving it, what the advice is, and what the outcome of the advice is, so that the citizen can be assured that the laws and the regulations are being made in a fair and independent and transparent way.
I know pesticides is something else you've called as a Commission to question question on this idea that it might be granting permission to use a certain amount of them before having all the scientific data may be necessary to make such a decision.
Yes, and this was a complaint that came to us from an NGO, a pan-European NGO that works in the area of pesticides and human health and so on and so forth. And they claimed that basically the Commission was authorising pesticides for sale and use in the EU before they were in position to say that they were safe for human health, before they had all the information that they needed. And they were using a particular procedure called the confirmatory data procedure, which was only supposed to be used in a very narrow, restrictive way, just to be absolutely sure that something was okay to do. That they were using it in a very regular way. And so we've asked them to stop doing that. We also discovered that 10 pesticides had been licensed for, had been authorised for use in the European market, even though the Public Health Food Safety Watchdog, the European Food and Safety Authority, had said that there were information gaps in relation to whether or not we knew whether they were safe or not. So again, we've told the Commission to go back, do its homework, check that those tests have been properly carried out. And a third one, which was of particular interest to certain member states, was that even though the Commission a few years ago had recalled certain pesticides on the grounds that there were certain health risks had been discovered about them, they were still on sale or were still being used in certain member states. So there was a lot absolutely. So there was a lot that the Commission had to get right. So we don't just make the recommendations and go away. We check on it. So we've asked the Commission to come back in 2 years' time and show us proof that they have done what we've asked them to do. And in fairness, they have agreed to do that.
Okay, so yeah, because being the EU Ombudsman, you can't force change, you can just recommend it. But you've been in the office since the end of 2013. How have you seen things? Have you seen things improve over the years?
Well, it's a very interesting time to be in Europe at the moment, obviously. I mean, I think a lot of our work has to do with transparency and lobbying transparency, in many different aspects of the EU's work. And I suppose I was fortunate in that the Juncker Commission has made significant efforts to become more transparent, and so that has helped me to get a lot of issues across the line. But sometimes these things can come a bit too late, because I mean, if you look across Europe, you see everybody talking about we don't trust the EU, we don't trust our national parliaments and so on. So there is a crisis of trust. So I think I see my role, and I think when this role was developed 20 years ago, it was very much in that arena to try and help to bridge that gap, which we all talk about, between the EU and the citizens, and to enable trust to be built up by making sure that the institutions do what they're supposed to do under their own statutes, under the treaties, and of course under the Charter of Fundamental Rights.
Ms. O'Reilly, thanks so much for your time. Thanks also to you at home for having watched. That brings us to the end of this edition of Talking Europe. Have a good week.